How do you handle dark and serious material in a graphic novel? Hilary Chute, our graphic novel columnist, will talk to us about 3 new books that take on slavery, racism, and genocide. What's it like to be a literary matchmaker? Our matchbook columnist, Nicole Lamy, will be here to talk about her trade. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Hilary Chute joins us now from Cambridge, Massachusetts. She is one of our graphic novel columnists here at the Book Review and also a professor of English and Art and Design at Northeastern University. Hilary, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And you are also a repeat guest on the podcast. You joined us here last year with your most recent book, Why Comics? From Underground to Everywhere. Probably not out in paperback yet, but certainly out in hardcover.
Certainly out in hardcover, yes.
All right. So this week in your column, you reviewed 3 books. Just going to go quickly over the titles, and then we could talk about each of them and about why you chose them. So the first is Your Black Friend and Other Strangers by Ben Passmore. Then The Dead Eye and the Deep Blue Sea, a graphic memoir of modern slavery by Vinayak Anand Prum. And finally, We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust. And there are 3 authors, Neil Adams, Raphael Madoff, and Craig Yeo, with an introduction and afterword by Stan Lee. What made you decide to review these 3 books and to do them together? What's the common theme here?
Well, so the common theme here for me is the idea of documenting history in drawing. And obviously these books get at that idea in different ways. But they're all about documenting history, through the pen line, and they're all about stories of political dispossession. Your Black Friend by Ben Passmore is about the current state of race in America, and The Dead Eye and the Deep Blue Sea is about contemporary slavery, particularly on fishing vessels in Thailand. And We Spoke Out is sort of taking a wider view, collecting comics that have come out about the Holocaust from the 1950s to the present. So the theme here is something that I've been interested in for a long time, which is what can the pen line give us in terms of the idea of expressing historical reality that prose alone can't get at.
Well, let's start with that point and with the book, The Dead Eye and the Deep Blue Sea, and what reporting can get at and what it can't. Because here's a situation, a contemporary situation, that perhaps readers are not familiar with, the enslavement and human trafficking of Cambodians in Thailand. So what is the situation there and that he documents in this book?
Well, there's actually been some recent work on enslaved people who are forced to work on fishing vessels in the Indian Ocean. And one of the things that I find really interesting about this book is it does call attention in a larger context through several prefatory pieces to the situation of contemporary slavery in which an approximate 40 million people are, modern-day slaves. But in his particular case, he went in search of work from his Cambodian village, and this is something that happens typically. People go in search of work, and their passports are confiscated once they get over the border. So he was told that if he crossed the border into Thailand, he'd have a better chance of finding work. His wife was pregnant. He was, hoping to be able to pay her hospital fees. So it was a sort of desperate situation of poverty in which he crossed the border in order to find sustenance for his family. His passport was confiscated, and then he was taken aboard this vessel.
When did this happen?
2006.
Mm-hmm.
And he was on the vessel for 3 to 4 years. He actually managed to escape from the very dangerous fishing vessel where people died all the time, where he saw a person be decapitated with his own eyes on the vessel. And then when he escaped, he was actually put into another situation on land this time of being a slave. And he was finally liberated. So it's a pretty fascinating and pretty recent story. And one of the things I was so drawn to, I'm not trying to make a pun here in this story, is that sort of the hero of the story, so to speak, is actually drawing itself. So the very first chapter is called Drawing in the Dirt. And it's about how, as a child in his Cambodian village, he would, draw with a stick in the dirt. The very first pen and paper he ever owned had been given to him by a Vietnamese soldier who admired his drawing as a kid. Later, when he's on the vessel, he teaches himself how to tattoo. So again, that's sort of the work of figurative representation with the hand, here is transferred to tattooing, and it earns him a lot of, credit with his shipmates on the vessel. Even after that, when he's in a hospital, he draws caricatures of the nurses that helps win better treatment for everybody in the hospital. So there's really a theme of drawing here being something that is not only the book itself, but is something that has helped him out of tricky situations and, dire situations over the course of his life.
How did he get from his rescue to writing and publishing this book here in the U.S.?
So that's such a fascinating question for me. So this is sort of almost like the trick ending of the book itself, or it's the frame. So in a sort of upsetting and moving feature of this story, which is, a first-person testimony, when he finally made it back to his small Cambodian village, his wife and his, 5-year-old daughter, who he had never met, had a hard time reconciling his return. In fact, the sort of immediate response from his wife was that somehow she was being tricked. She didn't recognize him. He was heavily tattooed, whereas he hadn't been when he left.
Mm-hmm.
He had been through years of slavery. She was suspicious of him and suspicious of what had happened in terms of, just not knowing. He had sort of vanished. So he felt that he had to actually show his family in images what had happened to him, because words alone couldn't adequately express what his experience had been.
Mm-hmm.
So he started drawing the story that we read actually in order to show his wife and child what had happened since he had left them, so to speak. In a sort of interesting twist, there's an NGO that gets involved in his rescue in the final stages. And so there's a person associated with this NGO who encouraged him to publish this narrative, as a book.
Okay, so here's a tough question. This is a really gut-wrenching story and hard to dispute with the need to tell it. How difficult is it for you to sort of step back and assess it as a work of literature or work of art? And possibly even be critical given the situation that he's describing?
Well, luckily for me, maybe, I can dissociate those two things, in part because this is the kind of literature and the kind of testimony that I've spent, sort of 10 years studying. So to criticize the look of it would be, for instance, not to criticize the power of the story. I think the power of the story is always there. In this case, though, happily, I think the aesthetics of this book are really interesting. They aren't always in, books of this nature. But one of the really striking aspects of this book is that it's in really lush, full color. And a lot of these stories that have this kind of immediacy and urgency of testimony and testimony of trauma are in black and white. They're often very rough looking, sketchy. That can be appealing because one sort of senses the immediacy jump off the page.
Mm-hmm.
But this book has a very finished quality to the drawings. So they're in full color. They're figurative and realistic with some sort of fantastical elements. And, we learn the story of his artistic training in this book, right? It's where he starts. So in a way, it's a kind of Bildungsroman or a Kunstlerroman of sorts, because we see him in the opening of the book drawing in the dirt, and then the end product is this book we read. The composition of the book is pretty interesting. I have to say it made me feel a little seasick,
mm-hmm.
which I then realized was sort of, parallel or rhymed with what this book is about, which is largely being out at sea. So it's not panelized the way comics are typically panelized. There's sort of wavy lines that separate panels on a page of comics, and there isn't space in between. So some of the pages look like puzzle pieces. They look like sort of distorted puzzle pieces, which could have an unappealing aesthetic effect. But when you think about the kind of dislocation and disorientation that this book is struggling to express, it makes a lot of sense. but I would say there can be a sort of seasick effect.
All right, let's talk about Ben Passmore's Your Black Friend and Other Strangers, which is very different in many ways, including the fact that, for one thing, it takes the more traditional format of panels, though it does change styles within the book, going from color to black and white to a kind of open panel-free sections.
One of the things I really love about Ben Passmore's work is the incredible range that he has as an artist, and that's registered both at the level of style and also, as I point out in the column, at the level of story. So some of these stories are stories that are observed, everyday life.
So this is a collection of short stories in graphic novel form.
Yes. So
Okay.
This is a collection of pieces, some fiction, some nonfiction, collected under the title Your Black Friend and Other Strangers, with Your Black Friend being the title piece. So some of the stories are observed from everyday life. Some of the stories are reported. For example, he has a story here sort of reporting about different protests and different rallies. He does comics reporting for a website called The Nib, which specializes in comics reporting. And some of these stories are about aliens punching each other and that type of thing, all set against a sort of gorgeous, sprawling, dystopic future landscape. So he's really hitting a lot of different genre registers in this book.
I don't want to make you go through all of the stories, but let's talk about the title story, Your Black Friend.
So the title story is a story that I've been keen to write about, since the moment I first read it. It sort of came out of nowhere in the sense that it was initially published by Passmore, self-published for Cake, which is an independent comics festival in Chicago, and then it was picked up by a tiny and really interesting publisher in San Francisco, which bills itself as, a punk music label, a micro press, an activist art collective, a bicycle crew, and a publisher of comics and zines. So one of the things I love as a person who spends a lot of time, thinking about contemporary comics is when something comes out of a tiny press like this, that's basically a punk collective, and just makes a huge splash. And so Your Black Friend was issued as mini comics, which is to say, in the sort of contemporary culture of comics, a self-published standalone comics pamphlet.
Mm-hmm.
And it won a lot of industry awards. It got a huge response because it's such an incisive look at the sort of uncomfortable relationships between black and white friends who are on nominally the same side of a political divide. So it's really about the kind of left-wing, deeply politicized, anarchist punk collective scene in New Orleans, and how even people who purport to be so politically cognizant are still making really radical missteps in terms of being unable to recognize the different experiences of their black friends. And so it's a really powerful piece sort of from the heart, and I'm just so excited now that it's out between hardcovers because I think it will get a wider audience, and I think it really deserves to.
All right, very different book, but our listeners will be able to tell already that the themes are common here. We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust, which is really an anthology.
Yes, so We Spoke Out is an anthology. It has 18 stories that vary in length from 2 to 25 pages. The first, I think, is from 1951, and the most recent, is from 2008, I think. So one of the things I was interested in with all of the books that I write about for this column is that they're all episodic, and they're all sort of fragmented in this way. Even Prum's book, which is one testimony throughout, is sort of broken up into these short sections. And I think that the effect of that is to communicate that certain kinds of traumatic memories sort of exist as fragments, right? It's not a linear narrative. It's something that sort of can't be contained in a linear narrative. And then with We Spoke Out, the collection has a sort of similar effect. There's a lot of different kinds of work here. But I do want to emphasize that unlike the other works I've been talking about, this book is mostly fictional stories. There are only 2 pieces that are non-fictional. And it's heavily invested, like some of Ben Passmore's work is, in genre. We get some pieces that feel realistic in the look and in the texture. They're representative in terms of drawing. They're trying to get at a historical facet of the Holocaust. And we get some pieces, that feature Nazis turning into green monsters.
So these are all fragments or stories from comic books that were published at the time, including things like Batman and Captain America and Captain Marvel.
Exactly. And I think one of the real strengths of this book as a collection, especially because I'm a person who has paid a lot of close attention to comics about the Holocaust across the board, is that it collects some things that feel, pretty obvious to anybody who knows comics culture, right? So there's an X-Men story about the Holocaust, for example, and that's pretty interesting, and it's pretty long. Like you said, they're Batman stories, they're Captain Marvel stories. But then there are also, to me, really esoteric stories that I had never heard of before, even though, like I said, this overlap is sort of one of my scholarly, areas of interest, published by comics publishers that either don't exist anymore or that were pretty small time. Places like Warren Publishers or Youthful Magazines. These are publishers that haven't really persisted in the public imagination. And one thing that feels so exciting about this collection is that it's preserving some work that's in some cases really weird work, for the public in order to, and this is how I put it in the column, sort of provide a kind of time capsule of what Americans were able to imagine about the Holocaust or able to want to express about the Holocaust during these years.
So let's talk a little bit about the authors and how they found all these obscure works. It was Neil Adams, Raphael Madoff, and Craig Yo. Are they comics historians?
So one of the 3 is a sort of comics historian. So it's an interesting group. So Neil Adams is a very famous comic book artist who's, worked on titles like X-Men, Batman, Green Lantern, Green Arrow. He's a very well-known figure in 20th century and 21st century, mainstream comics. He's worked for Marvel, he's worked for DC, he's done really important work in that area. So he teamed up with Raphael Madoff, who runs an Institute for Holocaust Studies in Washington, D.C., and is a historian, and Craig Yo, who has been a long-time person in the comic scene, publishing, countless volumes of esoteric comics through his own imprint for years. And so he teamed up with IDW, which published this book. So you have a comic book artist, a Holocaust historian, and, a comic book publisher working together to put out this book. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that this whole book was actually inspired by one story, which is the last story of the book. And this is a story I mentioned in the column. It is about Dina Babbitt. So it was inspired by the one story that is a non-fictional, and substantial story. So this is about an Auschwitz inmate who was spared her life because she drew portraits in the camps, and she was asked to draw portraits of people. Specifically, she was asked to draw portraits of so-called, at that time, gypsies, because Nazi officials didn't think that photography adequately captured the brown skin tones of gypsies. So they wanted a painter to paint them. And this was all, of course, for so-called scientific purposes. And so that's a really fascinating story that Neil Adams collaborated on back in 2008 with Raphael Madoff, this Holocaust historian who actually wrote the story. So this story is sort of the germ for the whole book. 10 years ago, a Holocaust historian and a famous comic book artist decided to get together and write this piece called The Last Outrage about this woman's experience being a painter in the camps and then, unfortunately, not being able to recover her paintings as an adult when she was liberated from the camps. So this is an ongoing dispute. The Auschwitz Museum doesn't want to return her paintings to her because they think they have educational purpose and should live at the museum in Poland.
Really brings you back to the theme of the first book of documenting these horrors as they occur with the prom book.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a real link here of, literally sort of drawing to live. Dina Babbitt was sort of painting for her life. Prum, taught himself how to tattoo in order to survive on board, and then, drew this book in order to document his experiences, which then Raphael Medoff and Neil Adams did, in the case of Dina Babbitt, drew this story in order to show, what her experience had been. And actually, this story has small reproductions of her paintings of so-called gypsies embedded within it. So it's a really interesting piece.
Well, it's totally fascinating to talk to you about this. I feel like readers will be inspired to look at the books themselves, obviously books that deserve to be seen as much as read. The three titles, again, are Your Black Friend and Other Strangers by Ben Passmore, The Dead Eye and the Deep Blue Sea, a graphic memoir of modern slavery by Vinayak Anand Prum, and We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust by Neil Adams, Raphael Madoff, and Craig Yo. And Hillary, thank you so much for being here and for writing about all three of them in your most recent column.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hillary Chute is one of our graphic content columnists here at the Book Review and is also the author of Why Comics. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Nicole Lamy joins us now from Cambridge. This is our Cambridge podcast. She is also our Matchbook columnist for the Book Review. Nicole, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about the idea behind Matchbook as a column and what you do.
The idea behind Matchbook is it's like giving a present to your literary friends or your book-loving friends. So just like when you read a book and you think a book reminds you of somebody, I wanted to do that on a larger scale where people would be really specific about their requests. They would write letters to me. And then I would think not about my own taste or books that I love that I would recommend, but what, based on the letter and the request, what would suit them exactly.
So you're like a book therapist in a way.
Could be something like that, sure, like a
guide.
I'll take it.
Because you're thinking not of necessarily your own taste, but of their taste as kind of like a personalized reading guide for them?
Yes, that's what it is.
Okay.
It's more like something that you would get at if you go to a library or to a bookstore, to your favorite independent bookstore, and you trust someone who knows your taste. But the advantage for me is that I get to spend essentially 1 week really thinking about one person's taste. So sometimes I don't know that letter writers always know this, but I'm thinking about the letter. Sometimes I go back and forth with a letter writer over the course of a week, and I try to get to know them. So I'm thinking about them and their life and what they might like to read, mostly for a week or two.
Okay, so let's talk about how that actually goes. So you get email to you at matchbook@nytimes.com. People email you with their requests. And then where does it go from there? There's a follow-up. I'm assuming sometimes maybe they don't provide you enough information or you have more questions. How does that work?
All the time. People often just send me something that says in the subject line, like, I loved Stoner by John Williams. That is a title that people talk about a lot. And then I say that, give me more a sense of who you are as a reader. Mm-hmm. So I want to know what other books they liked, what books they didn't like. Tell me about yourself a little bit. Where do you live? What do you do for a job? Where do you read? So the letter that you read either online or in the book review is often the product of me going back and forth 4 or 5 times with the letter writer to try to piece together a literary profile.
And I imagine that sometimes they are looking for a book for themselves, but other times looking for a book for someone else. And what's the breakdown there like?
I would say mostly people are looking for themselves. I recently had a return customer this week, someone who asked for poetry to exchange with her granddaughter. She has been through the list that I gave her already, and she's back for more. So those are rewarding and wonderful letters to get. I love to get follow-up letters from readers to tell me if I did a good job or not. I want to know if the recommendations worked for them and if they've made it through the list already and they want, more suggestions.
Wow. Tell us a story about someone who wrote back after reading your recommendations.
Oh, so it happens all the time. So that's one example. This woman wrote looking for poetry for her granddaughter. She had this lovely project in mind where they would exchange journals weekly. And she would copy down a poem, and then I think she has an 8-year-old granddaughter, would read the poem and then give her, either write her reactions in a journal or give her grandmother a poem back. And then the grandmother wrote to say, all of those suggestions worked really well. Thank you. We are through them all. Please give us some more. I thought that was really great.
Have you ever just been completely sort of stymied by a letter, like where you just don't know how to help?
There's one that I worked on for a really long time. That's not exactly stymied, but it took me a really long time.
What did the person want?
The person wanted to read 5 novels straight through without stopping for 6 different writers. And I knew that was going to take me a really long time. And I felt like that person was trying to stump me a little bit. And I liked that. I think people have gotten to know that I like really specific requests because those are the most fun. Those are the most fun to research. So often when I read a letter, I'll have a spark of an idea, and sometimes that spark absolutely dies, and sometimes it leads me on an entirely new path, which is really wonderful. So these 5 books in a row, it took me, I don't know, maybe 2.5 months reading between weeks to get that list ready for this particular reader.
So it's not like necessarily all of these books off the top of your head. You actually do a lot of research.
No, I mean, the ones that are the most successful are the letters where I read it and I think, I can think of 5 off the top of my head, but what often happens is I go back and reread these books, and this is interesting, and they're not what I remembered, or they're not going to work for this particular letter writer. But what happens is when I'm researching and I'm in the stacks of the library, I get new ideas from the old books that I had thought of.
It's not like you know nothing about books because, of course, you have a background here. What were you doing before you were the Matchbook columnist?
I was the books editor of the Globe for about 6 years.
For the Boston Globe.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. And do you find that experience was helpful, I'm assuming, in terms of being able to answer these queries? And how, in what ways is that job different?
So the great part is that I've been either writing book reviews or editing book reviews for most of my career. And I've always done it at small places. So the Globe is a big place, but it's a very small books office. So every book that came in, I touched and evaluated myself. And you get hundreds of books a day as a book review editor. So that is what helped me. For many years, I am the person who looked at every book. I came into contact. I went through every single catalog. I ordered every single book. So that experience really helped me. And I worked at a very small standalone monthly book review called the Boston Book Review much earlier.
All right. So I think that you can tell a lot about people by the books that they read and the books they want to read and the books they intend to read, but the books they don't finish, the books they love and the ones they don't. I'm certain that you get a kind of read on what's going on with the readers of America through this column. Do you see sort of trends, things that people are concerned about, worried about, things that they're longing for?
Absolutely. One of the recent Matchbook columns we ran was about trying to find an escape. It seems like people either want to escape from politics and world affairs, or they want to learn more. That's probably 60% of the letters I get. I mean, fully 60%. People say either I need to know more about our current political situation, I need to know more about, people I don't understand or I don't necessarily relate to, I need to learn more, or I don't want to learn any more at all. I just need to escape. That's definitely true.
What about for children and parents of children and other caregivers? Is there any theme that's come out in terms of what people are looking for in children's books?
Another recent letter had to do with a reluctant reader. And what happens a lot is when a letter runs, it brings more readers out of the woodwork who say, essentially, then I got a flood of letters from other parents saying, oh, yes, I have a reluctant reader too. So that will often unlock something. So especially for the summer, people want their children to read more. So I'm getting a lot of letters right now from parents who want to encourage their children to read.
All right, let's talk about the column that runs this week in the book review, because it's something that always interests me, which is that, people in the summer don't necessarily want to read just quick and light kind of books, but sometimes they really want to dive in.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that I like the most is when you go to a summer house, if you are renting a house or you're staying at a hotel or you're staying away, one of my first instincts, I'm sure it's true for many readers, is you go and look and see what other people have left on the bookshelf. And I think that you always see thick books that are, that people want to just immerse themselves in. I think that summer is an immersive reading time. So I love to see, in fact, I would love it if people sent me pictures of books that they found on the bookshelves where they were in the houses or the hotels where they were staying, because it's always so fun to see what people have left. And it's a mishmash of what people have left and what the owners of the house have left, and it's really fun. But in particular, I think family sagas, when you open up the book and you see the family tree in the early pages of the book, you know that you're in for a treat. I think that's the kind of ideal summer reading.
So the person who wrote the first letter this week said that, she liked A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth, Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner, The Forsyte Saga, and Elena Ferrante, as well as, of course, War and Peace. What do you suggest to someone who's already read all of those? This
was one of those chances for me to bring up, this doesn't always work, but often I have a list of books that, for whatever reason, I feel like people aren't reading anymore. And I have a list of them, and often I can't shoehorn them in because it doesn't always work for readers' taste. It's often just I'm imposing my own taste on people, but it was a chance for me to bring up these R.F. Delderfield books. He's a British writer. He wrote this series about the Swan family. I had these mass market paperbacks of these books when I was growing up. It follows this family and this guy named Adam Swan and generations of his family. So I was happy to bring those up again. And I think I also mentioned 100 Years of Solitude, which is a classic family saga.
All right, last question. I have to ask, what are you reading right now?
That's a great question. What am I reading right now? I am reading Asymmetry, like everybody. I am reading...
This is the Lisa Halliday book that came out in January.
Yes, and I'm also reading the Tommy Orange novel.
There.
Yes. I'm reading a book by Lynn Tillman called Men and Apparitions, which is really wonderful. I'm a big fan of hers. Another thing that I love is in the summertime, I love to read like a big, fat 19th century novel. So I usually go back and, for pleasure, reread a big, fat 19th century novel. So
that sounds like a very enjoyable summer. Nicole, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Nicole Lamy is our Matchbook columnist, and her latest column runs this week in the book review with family epics as its major theme. Alexandra Alter joins us now with news from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's going on?
So there was some exciting news this week. The Booker long list was announced, and it was especially interesting this year. It was the first time ever that a graphic novel has made the long list of the Man Booker Prize. Of course, that's the most prestigious literary award in Britain, and I think it's taken on additional interest this year, given that there's not going to be a Nobel later. So I think it's going to be probably the most closely watched award of the year. And I hadn't heard of this graphic novel before, but I certainly want to read it now. now. It's called Sabrina. It's by Nick Dornasso. And it's been called an extraordinary work. And the minute the long list was announced, the sales spiked on Amazon. The book shot up to the top. It was out of stock. And I imagine it will take a while to reprint something this intricate, but it seems like it's generated a ton of interest in it.
How many books make the long list?
So there are 13 books.
And is that a fixed number? Is it always 13?
It's usually around a dozen books. I think they think that's a nice broad number to give a good scope of what's been out that year and what's getting attention. And then they narrow it down to 6 for the short list. And, I think they try to do a range of styles and genres, although they say that they're always going for the best books, of course. They're not trying to game it in terms of geography. That's been the most controversial issue in recent years, ever since they opened the prize up to English language novels from any country. And Americans have won the last 2. People have been sort of looking at these long lists and lists of finalists and sort of saying Americans are dominating. And, that did happen a little bit. Again, this year you saw Rachel Kushner on there and Richard Powers was on there. So there were certainly Americans were well represented, but I think most people were excited to see a graphic novel for the first time.
And is the author of Sabrina American as well?
He is. He's actually from Chicago, apparently. So he's one of the 3 Americans on the long list this year.
So 3 out of 13, not totally dominating.
No, not yet. And we'll see. Often the Americans lately have been getting onto the short list as well, and then they've been winning. So we'll see how far this goes. But it was fascinating because I think graphic novels have really come to be appreciated as a literary art form. And, graphic novels have won the National Book Award in the past. So I think a lot of people were very excited to see the Booker Committee, honoring this form and sort of expanding the horizon of the prize to include this form.
What else made the list?
So a lot of fantastic books made the list. As usual, I hadn't heard of all of them, but I had heard of some of them, and I've even read a few.
Well, not all have come out in the U.S. yet.
Exactly. That's right. Some familiar authors. There was Rachel Kushner, who was nominated for The Mars Room, and Richard Powers, who was nominated for The Overstory.
Both covers of the book review.
There you go. A novel that I'm sort of dipping into and really enjoying that's coming out this fall, titled Washington Black by Essie Edugan.
Mm-hmm.
There's Michael Ndonje's Warlight and Sally Rooney's Normal People, which I've heard incredible things about, and From a Low and Quiet Sea by Donal Ryan. That's not everything, but those are some of the ones that jumped out at me.
Well, I'm very excited for the ones that have not yet come out here.
I am too. And in fact, here is something interesting that the Man Booker is trying this year, I guess, to raise awareness about the prize. If you happen to live in London and you happen to be an IKEA shopper, IKEA is partnering with the Man Booker Prize to put together a reading room that's going to be filled with copies of these books, of these 13 long-listed titles. So for those of you that live in London and like to lounge around in IKEA furniture and want to read something other than a Swedish book that's on a display sort of bookcase, you can grab one of these books in London for a while and curl up with it.
All right, attention shoppers. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, I've got my colleagues Greg Coles, Tina Jordan, and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
John, what are you reading?
I am continuing my kick of classic Japanese novels, and so I've read 2 of them since we last spoke on the podcast, or I'm almost done with the second. The first was a book called Masks by Fumiko Enchi. I was at a party recently, I think it was around Book Expo maybe, and I started talking to a woman who is a translator, and I told her about this project of mine, and she said, "Oh, what novels will you be reading?" And I listed, 5 or 6 of them. And she said, "I hate to tell you that there are no women on that list." And I said, "Well, please correct that and tell me what I should read." And so she recommended Masks, and I read it and really enjoyed it. It's about, much like the first book I read, it involves a subplot of 2 men who are in love with the same woman, and the men are friends. And basically the woman is a young widow. They're both in love with her, and they both fear that the mother-in-law of this woman has a very weird and troubling relationship with her, and that she's kind of manipulating both men for her own purposes. So there's an element of suspense to it. It was very good. And then, but I'm also now more than halfway through The Woman in the Dunes by Kobo Abe, which was also turned into a movie, which I never saw. So I'm not cheating. I am going through the books. This is a very strange book about a guy, an entomologist, who goes to this seaside town to look for a certain kind of bug, and he hasn't told anyone he's going. He's taken sort of a vacation from work without telling anyone. And
That doesn't sound like much of a vacation.
Yeah, no, it's not. He's a very obsessive guy. So this is his idea of fun, is trying to find this new kind of beetle instead of, sitting on the beach. And in this town, there's this very strange sort of well-described situation where the the ground ascends toward the dunes, and all these homes are sort of in these depressions in the dunes. So the homes are sort of down in these pits of sand. And he finds himself kind of held captive in one of these pits. They pull up this ladder that he had gotten down on, and now he is inscripted to sort of help this woman just constantly clean out the sand that keeps blowing into her in and around her house. And it's obviously a sort of Sisyphean allegory. It's very disturbing in that way because it's very claustrophobic, and you worry about how and if he's going to get out. And so I will know that by the next time I sit here, whether he got out.
So this is not beach reading.
Not
well,
really.
It's literally beach.
Right.
I wouldn't recommend it for a seaside jaunt.
John, I'm curious, since you were chastised for not having women on the list, has anybody recommended The Tale of Genji to you, which is widely considered the first Japanese novel? It goes back to like the 11th century.
Well, no one's recommended it because I think they know that I'm dealing with sort of more doable. To tell you, it's a giant book, but I know of it just from
by reputation.
School. Yeah. And I do think eventually I'll pick it up. I almost bought a copy the other day, but I felt like that was perverse. I'm just on the sort of early stages of this, so I'll wait. Tina, how about you? What are you reading these days?
Well, I think like a lot of people who looked at Parl's review of Craig Brown's 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, I have picked up the book. I think it was the detail in her review that Margaret affixed matchbooks to her tumblers so that she didn't have to put down her drinks when she wanted to light her cigarettes that did it for me.
Real innovator.
Yeah, innovator. And I have to tell you, I'm only maybe a third of the way through, but I'm galloping through. Craig Brown, the author, who, by the way, refers to conventional royal biographers as oleaginous, and he cites, in fact, William Shawcross's official bio of the Queen Mother and said, if you shut it too fast, stuff just oozes out of it. I mean, he's just got no patience. And he's obviously also got no patience for the restrictions of conventional biographies. So if you saw Parl's review, it's 99 chapters, and each of them is sort of a different way into her life. And
I love that approach.
I do too. And he's taken in this immense amount of material, but it's not boring. It's as gossipy and peevish and volatile and utterly fascinating as she obviously, was herself. And for somebody who refers to his subject as, let me get this quote right, a quote, nightmare burlesque of her sister, unquote, he's more sympathetic than you might think. For example, Snowden, her husband, was terrible to her.
I love that thing where he leaves the notes that say, I hate you under the pillow.
Yes, he left notes that said, I hate you. And when he left her, he left a note behind that said, you look like a Jewish manicurist. Like, that was the note. I mean,
goodbye.
Goodbye, right?
The traditional end to a relationship.
And it's so unconventional, this book. I've actually just gotten to a point where Brown is just sort of riffing on what would have happened if Margaret had become queen. And he's imagining Queen Margaret delivering the annual Christmas Day, radio talk that Elizabeth does. And I had to write this down too because it was so funny. I'll wish you all a very happy Christmas, not because I really want to, but because I suppose I must.
I feel like that's one of those reviews that when everyone here read it and around the building and sort of in my larger circle, that people just said, I need a copy of that book.
Yeah.
Can you get me a copy?
And the only reason
book?
I got it is that I was first. John told me.
I was besieged with requests.
I'm online. I think another of my favorite details from her review was that she was friendly with, I guess in whatever way she was friendly with people, Gore Vidal, and that she said something along the lines of, he wants my sister's job.
and there's all this stuff about smoking. She was a chain smoker. And, men who take her to dinner and try to light her cigarette. And she says, oh, no, you don't know me well enough for that. And she'll turn to somebody at another table in the restaurant. I mean.
She sounds like a real character.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to read that one myself.
But the thing was, she treated everybody so poorly, but it's like they all went home and wrote in their diaries about what a horrible person she was, and then went out to dinner with her again the next night.
I want to read the last line of Parl's review on that point because I thought it speaks exactly to that. Without ever explicitly positioning Margaret for our pity, Brown reveals how we elevate in order to destroy. Who or what in the final reckoning is the true grotesque? The absurd, unhappy princess, those desperate to get close to her, or the system propping them all up?
Exactly.
So brilliant.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
I don't know if any of you all watch The Crown on Netflix, but I do. And I have to say that Margaret is the riveting, she steals the show.
She steals the show.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I hate to say this, but she's the smart one,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth is
Elizabeth
is very smart, but and has to navigate a lot that Margaret is freed from navigating. And in fact, I mean, Parle's review gets at this, that
how she
it's
had
her job to be the bad girl,
right.
to kind of defy convention that Elizabeth is bound by.
Right.
So,
I'm going to cast aside my shock that you are a devoted watcher of The Crown.
I am too, and that's how I got into. I'm not like an Anglophile, but it's that show.
No, Tina doesn't shock me because I know you're a devoted royal watcher. Yes,
I don't care about the royals at all, but I think The Crown is a very entertaining show.
And this is why you haven't finished Ulysses.
I am rolling right along in Ulysses. I am maintaining my steady clip of about 20 pages a week, which is far less than I normally read in the course of things. But for Ulysses, it feels about right. And I'm making progress. I'm edging toward halfway through.
It looks like you're almost there.
I've crossed the 300-page mark.
Greg has a very well-worn bookmark-like object stuck into the book here.
I'm now well within the Cyclops episode of Ulysses, which I recognize because, again, I'm reading Emily Wilson's Odyssey alongside Ulysses.
How far are you into the Odyssey? Where's your bookmark in there?
Yeah, maybe don't ask me that. Okay. Not very far is the answer.
Retract the question.
What I'm doing in the Odyssey is reading around in it to find, because I didn't start reading them side by side, I've kind of skipped to the places that are useful to me as I'm reading Ulysses. I'm reading it more for reference than I am kind of straight through. Yeah. So I'm looking for the parallels, but I'm not kind of reading the two books at the same time.
That was a really nice way of saying that you're reading something without actually reading it.
It
was persuasive.
It's like Google. It's like a paper version of Google for me. I don't want to actually study Ulysses. I just want to read and enjoy it, but I need something to anchor me in it. And the Odyssey has been that for me. It's been like Googling, or it's like a Cliff's Notes, almost. It kind of says, all right, here's what's going on.
This is like the book review editor's version of the Cliff Notes, because most high schoolers would be like, wait, you're reading a new translation of Homer as a form of Cliff Notes? You're reading a novel?
Just what Homer intended.
Yes.
Yeah.
Emily, you've got your own non-galloping. Well, no, actually, you are galloping.
I am galloping.
It's kind of crazy. You're almost done.
I am almost done. The book I'm reading is Robert Tombs's The English and Their History. Not that I'm being competitive with Greg, but I'm on page 805 of this.
805, I'd be done.
Yeah, of this 900-page book. What started off as there's a kind of therapeutic aspect to this book in that events take hundreds of years to unfold, and, you're sort of constantly in the long view. So I may have said this on an earlier podcast, but, if something happens in the endless news cycle of the moment, I'll just think, and even if it has long-term implications, I think, well, it'll be like the 30 Years' War, and like 20 years later, people have just forgotten about it, or they'll have moved on, which was working until I got to the last 100 or so pages. He devotes the first 400 pages to millennia of history, and then from about page 400 on, you are in the 19th century and onward. So it slows in terms of the historical pacing. What's happening now is that it's no longer that kind of escapist reading, but is much more pertinent to today, because now we're coming up on the sort of actual execution of Brexit, assuming that moves forward. And so, and in the book, I'm in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So as a reader, it's sort of constantly forcing me to look at the germs of that movement in the last sort of century of history.
Well, luckily there's not much left, and then you can get back to Twitter and all the good news.
That's right. No, then I can get onto my summer of thrillers inspired by Tina's thriller issue of the book review.
It sounds like such a thoughtful approach in terms of the historiography that I'm surprised it also seems like a page turner given the rate at which you've been reading it.
It is kind of a page turner, and one of the things about reading huge historical events in a highly condensed form is you realize the interconnectedness of a number of events that were taking place in different arenas around the globe, so that if you read something very condensed about World War II, it gives you a very clear sense of what was going on at D-Day, whereas, in the American perspective of the war, that was so central. That's sort of the be-all and end-all, and yet there were all these things going on in the Pacific arena that we don't necessarily think about as happening during the same period. But I'm getting through it. I will be done with it by the time we next convene.
That's a promise.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.